Everything started with a roaring engine that changed my life forever. That Sunday afternoon seemed perfect as I admired my newly restored '72 Chevelle in the garage of the Pacific Heights condominium in Seattle. After 2 years of pouring my heart into the restoration, every chrome detail caught the sunset like a mirror. That's when I heard those determined footsteps on the concrete. Susan Patterson was coming over in her signature beige linen outfit with a clipboard in hand. Her disapproving look said it all, though I had no idea that this moment would mark the beginning of a personal battle at our once peaceful condo. With her perfectly styled hair and impeccable posture, she embodied everything I wasn't. The old guard of Pacific Heights going head-to-head with a young game designer who loved vintage cars. I had no clue that our meeting would kick off a chain of events that would forever change our community. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. That first encounter with Susan quickly turned into a daily nightmare. The very next morning, I found a pink paper notice stuck to the Chevelle's windshield, warning me about supposed violations of the condo rules. I ignored it, thinking it was just the overzealous fuss of an old-school resident. But I was wrong. The following week, when I got back from work, I discovered a tow truck parked right in front of my garage. Chuck, the driver, looked embarrassed as Susan gestured wildly and showed him some papers. I got close enough to overhear her trying to convince him that my car was breaking several condo rules. Chuck, a level-headed guy, excused himself and murmured that he wasn't going to participate in any of it. Things got worse when Susan started snapping photos of my car at different times of the day. I'd catch her standing right in front of my garage, documenting every moment I started the engine. Complaints about noise kept pouring in, even when the car had been off for days. During a condo meeting, she presented a full dossier on how my restoration project was harming the visual harmony of Pacific Heights. Some of the older residents nodded in agreement, while others rolled their eyes, clearly fed up with all the exaggeration. Robert Wilson, a retired university professor who lived in the next building, was the first to openly defend me. In the middle of the meeting, he stood up and questioned if the real issue was the car or a hidden intolerance toward younger residents. His words brought an awkward silence, but the look Susan threw my way made it clear that this was far from over. The harassment started to take on frightening proportions. Every morning when I left for work, I'd find a new anonymous note on my door. Although Susan's meticulous handwriting was unmistakable, the messages ranged from friendly suggestions for getting rid of the car to veiled threats about accidents that could happen to poorly parked vehicles. I installed a discreet camera in the garage, one that sends alerts to your phone. The notifications started coming in at increasingly odd hours. Susan appeared at 3 or 4 in the morning, inspecting my car with a flashlight. In some recordings, she was accompanied by 2 other older residents, pointing at different parts of the Chevelle as if they were cataloging imaginary violations. The harassment spilled over into the condo's online group. On WhatsApp, she constantly shared news about old car accidents and dubious studies about noise pollution. When I stepped into the elevator, other residents whispered and quickly changed the subject. The atmosphere was getting more and more tense. One particularly stressful afternoon, I caught Susan measuring the distance between my car and the parking lines with a tape measure. When I asked her what she was doing, she simply replied that she was exercising her right as a board member to ensure the rules were followed. At that moment, I saw an obsessive glint in her eyes. It had become a personal crusade. Things hit another level when I started receiving condo fines for non-existent infractions. Using her influence on the board, Susan had devised a new system of penalties that seemed tailor-made to get me. Regulations about historic-looking vehicles and time limits for aesthetic maintenance popped up out of nowhere in the internal rules. Robert, my retired neighbor, warned me that Susan had done something similar to a young family who'd lived there for a few years, eventually forcing them to move after a series of arguments over the color of their curtains. I realized I had to take more serious action before the situation spiraled completely out of control. The turning point came on a rainy October night. My phone alarm went off at 2:17 in the morning, alerting me to movement in the garage. In the security camera footage, I saw 3 hooded figures approaching the Chevelle. My heart froze when I saw one of them holding something that looked like a screwdriver. I immediately called the police while I rushed down the stairs still in my pajamas. Officers James Miller and Sarah Collins arrived in less than 5 minutes. Later I learned they had been monitoring the situation because of multiple complaints over the past few months. The scene in the garage was surreal. Susan was standing next to the car, still holding the screwdriver, while 2 men were fleeing out the back exit. Her hood had fallen back, revealing that impeccably styled hair, which now looked completely out of place. The Chevelle sported several deep scratches on the body, and someone had tried to force the lock. "Ms. Patterson," Officer Collins said, "keep your hands where we can see them." The expression on Susan's face wavered between shock and indignation, as if she was the victim here. When the officers began reading her rights, she finally lost that artificial composure. "You don't understand," she yelled, pointing at me. "He's destroying everything we built here. That car, that guy, they don't belong at Pacific Heights. We have standards to maintain." The high-definition cameras I had installed captured every detail. The expressions, the movements, even the moment Susan remotely organized the attack over her phone. Officers Miller and Collins methodically gathered all the evidence, including the screwdriver that, as we later found out, had her fingerprints all over it. The commotion drew a crowd of residents into the garage. Robert arrived first, still in his bathrobe, followed by a group of younger neighbors who had quietly supported me. Seeing Susan in handcuffs seemed to break some kind of spell over the condo. Suddenly, people started speaking up. "She even threatened me because of my balcony plants," said one resident from the 4th floor. "My daughter stopped roller skating here because of all the harassment," commented another neighbor. Officer Collins noted down every testimonial while Officer Miller led Susan to the squad car. Before she got into the car, she turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "You won't last here. None of you will." But she was wrong. That night changed everything at Pacific Heights. As I watched the squad car drive away, I noticed residents lingering in the garage, chatting with one another, many for the first time in years. Robert put his hand on my shoulder and said, "It's over, kid, and something tells me we're about to see some really positive changes around here." Looking at my damaged Chevelle under the fluorescent lights of the garage, I realized that this car had become more than just a restoration project. It had sparked a much-needed transformation in our community. In the weeks following Susan's arrest, Pacific Heights underwent a real revolution. An extraordinary meeting was called to reorganize the condo board, and for the first time in 15 years, nearly all residents participated in the vote. It was as if everyone had finally woken up from a long period of intimidation. During the meeting, we discovered that Susan had built a real terror regime over the years. Old records revealed a chilling pattern of harassment, always targeting younger residents or families who didn't fit her personal idea of what the condo should be. She kept detailed files on every resident, with notes about their routines, visitors, and even private conversations she accidentally overheard. The criminal case against her moved quickly. The evidence was irrefutable. In addition to the high-definition footage from the night of the vandalism, the police found all the proof they needed in her apartment. Notebooks with elaborate plans to force me out, receipts incriminating her for paying the 2 men who helped attack my car, and even a map of the garage with notes on blind spots from the old security cameras. At the same time, other residents started reaching out. Mark and Jenny, a couple from the 6th floor who barely knew me, offered help with restoring the Chevelle. I found out that Mark was a retired mechanic who had worked with classic cars for decades. On Sundays, the garage became a meeting point. As we worked on the car, more neighbors would drop by with coffee, sharing their own stories. Robert took charge as the new board leader, implementing changes that completely transformed the atmosphere. The old rules, which Susan had tweaked over the years to suit her own purposes, were completely rewritten. The new regulations focused on fostering a harmonious living environment instead of arbitrary restrictions. The board's first initiative was to organize a monthly community event. Ironically, my Chevelle became the star of the first gathering, a breakfast in the common area where residents brought photos of their classic cars and shared restoration stories. I discovered I wasn't the only one passionate about vintage rides in the condo. It was just that nobody felt comfortable showing their interests before. Sarah, a software developer from the 2nd floor whom I barely knew, suggested creating an app for the condo, a platform where we could share events, exchange experiences, and even organize carpools. Her idea was enthusiastically embraced, especially by the older residents who saw it as a chance to connect. The Chevelle's restoration became a community project. Every scratch buffed out and every part restored represented a collective victory over the fear and intolerance Susan had instilled. People stopped by to check the progress, offered suggestions, and shared their know-how. That car, which Susan had tried so hard to expel, ended up becoming a symbol of unity at Pacific Heights. In less than 2 months, the condo's vibe was unrecognizable. Hallways that were once silent and tense now echoed with conversations and laughter. People weren't just nodding in the elevator. They were really talking and showing interest in one another. Susan's trial happened 6 months after the incident. The The courtroom was packed with Pacific Heights residents, not out of revenge, but out of a shared sense of closure. She pleaded guilty to vandalism and conspiracy, receiving a sentence that included community service and a restraining order. Her apartment was put up for sale the following week. A young family with 2 kids bought Susan's unit. On moving day, I witnessed something extraordinary. A line of neighbors taking turns to help carry boxes, furniture, and toys. The children, Sophie and Lucas, aged 7 and 5, ran through the hallways while their parents, Elena and Marcus, tried to bring order to the chaos of the move. Pacific Heights was finally breathing new life. The fully restored Chevelle became a sort of mascot for the condo. I started organizing Sunday drives, taking different groups of residents to check out historic spots around Seattle. The older residents especially loved these outings, as they brought back memories of their youth. Mrs. Thompson from the 8th floor even cried as she sat in the passenger seat. Her first boyfriend had a similar car back in the 60s. Sarah's app completely revolutionized our communication. Beyond the basic features, she added a section called Pacific Memories, where residents shared old photos of the building and stories from the early years of the condo. We discovered that Pacific Heights had been one of Seattle's first modern buildings, designed by an architect who believed in spaces that encouraged people to connect. In one of the monthly meetings, Robert proposed turning an abandoned area on the ground floor into a community lounge. Over 3 weekends, residents of all ages came together to create a cozy spot with sofas, bookshelves, and even a small cafe. Elena, who used to work as a barista before having kids, offered to manage the space a few hours a day. What was most surprising was how small changes led to big transformations. The parking spots, once a source of territorial disputes, turned into a meetup zone where people exchanged car maintenance tips. The old bulletin board Susan used to pin warnings now displayed photos of condo events and offers of neighborly help. One Saturday afternoon, as I was waxing the Chevelle in the garage, Sophie and Lucas came up asking if they could lend a hand. As I patiently explained how to wax a car, I noticed several residents watching the scene with smiles. Mark joked that I was mentoring the next generation of Pacific Heights restorers. The condo, which once felt like a prison of rules and restrictions, had turned into a real community. People were no longer just living under the same roof. They were sharing their lives, celebrating victories together, and supporting each other through tough times. And to think it all started with a '72 Chevelle and a headstrong building manager, determined to keep things her way. 1 year after the incident with Susan, we organized a special celebration at Pacific Heights. It was a sunny Sunday morning, and the common area was decorated with photos that told the story of our transformation. The Chevelle, now looking pristine, was parked in the spotlight, surrounded by neighbors admiring its restored shine. Elena had prepared a special breakfast in the community space, lovingly dubbed the Pacific Corner. The scent of fresh coffee and just-baked bread filled the air, while Sophie and Lucas ran among the residents, handing out handmade bookmark tokens they'd crafted with the help of other neighbors. During the celebration, Robert climbed onto a makeshift platform to make a surprising announcement. Pacific Heights had been nominated for a Municipal Community of the Year award, a recognition for our remarkable social transformation and the example we set for harmonious living across generations. Sarah then unveiled the latest update of the condo app, which now included a skill-sharing system. Residents could offer classes, workshops, or simply swap knowledge. Mrs. Thompson, for instance, started teaching knitting to a group of young professionals looking to unwind after work. Mark and Jenny announced the creation of a classic car restoration club, inspired by the Chevelle's story. The group already had 5 members and planned monthly meetups to share tips and stories. Even some residents without vintage cars joined in, fascinated by the chance to learn about mechanics and restoration. In the midst of the celebration, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Chuck, the tow truck driver who had refused to go along with Susan's scheme at the very beginning. He wrote to say he'd been keeping up with the changes at Pacific Heights through friends, and that our story had even inspired other condo communities to review their management practices. The building's kids even put on a special performance, a short play retelling the Chevelle's story and how it brought the community together. Lucas, dressed as a little mechanic, and Sophie, playing a nice building manager, brought laughter and applause from everyone watching. Looking around, it was hard to believe this was the same place from a year ago, where once there was silence and suspicion, now there was a symphony of voices and laughter. Hallways that were once zones of surveillance and control had turned into spaces for casual encounters and friendly chats. What mattered most wasn't the physical changes or the new projects, but the transformation in the people. Neighbors who barely exchanged greetings were now sharing meals and stories. Older residents found renewed energy watching the building's children play, and young professionals discovered the wisdom and life lessons they could learn from their elders. As I leaned against the Chevelle observing the scene, I realized that sometimes the biggest changes start in the most unexpected ways. An old car, an authoritarian building manager, and a community willing to do things differently had created something really special. Pacific Heights was no longer just an address. It had become a true home, a community in the deepest sense of the word. The epilogue of this story took place 2 years later, in a moment that almost poetically closed the cycle. I was returning from one of our Sunday trips with the neighbors when I noticed a familiar car parked near Pacific Heights, a '72 Chevelle, very similar to mine but clearly in dire need of restoration. Next to the car, a young guy around 25 was anxiously looking over a piece of paper. I immediately recognized that look. It was the same expression I had when I was apartment hunting for the first time. I walked over and discovered that his name was Tom, and he was considering renting an apartment in the building next door. "Nice car," I said, nodding at his Chevelle. His eyes lit up, but his expression soon turned to worry when he mentioned that the building manager at the other condo had already warned him about trouble with old cars in the neighborhood. The déjà vu was remarkable. I invited Tom to come check out Pacific Heights. As we strolled through the building, we were greeted by several residents stopping by to say hello. At the Pacific corner, Elena served us coffee while Sophie and Lucas bombarded Tom with questions about his car. Robert, who was passing by, joined the conversation, and before we knew it, we were all sitting down, discussing restoration possibilities. Mark was already making plans to include the new Chevelle in the Classic Car Club meetups. 2 weeks later, Tom moved into an apartment at Pacific Heights. On moving day, just like what had happened with Elena and Marcus, a line of neighbors formed to help him out. His Chevelle found a special spot in the garage, right next to mine. Seeing both cars side by side in the garage made me reflect on how life turns around. What started out as a battle over a parking spot had transformed into something much bigger, a lesson about community, acceptance, and the importance of staying true to your values even when it's easier to give in to pressure. Pacific Heights continues to evolve and grow as a community, and every time I hear the distinctive roar of a V8 engine echoing through the garage, I smile, remembering that sometimes the best stories begin with a simple decision not to give up on what we believe in. 5 years after the incident with Susan, Pacific Heights became a benchmark in Seattle when it comes to condo living. We now regularly have visits from managers and administrators from other buildings who are interested in learning how we managed to create such an integrated and harmonious community. The Classic Car Club now boasts 15 active members, including 3 Chevelles, the newest belonging to Amanda, a young architect who moved in after hearing our community story. On Sundays, the garage transforms into a collective workshop, where knowledge and tools are freely shared. Robert retired from his role as building manager last year, but remains a constant presence at condo events. Ironically, his successor is Tom, the very guy with the Chevelle I met in front of the building. His leadership continues to nurture inclusivity and innovation, always exploring ways to strengthen the bonds between residents. Sophie and Lucas, now 12 and 10 years old, have become the condo's junior classic car experts. They spend hours in the garage learning about mechanics and restoration. Sophie has already decided she wants to be a mechanical engineer, while Lucas dreams of opening a repair shop just for vintage cars. Sarah's app evolved into a full community management platform, now adopted by several condo communities in the area. She even developed a special section devoted to documenting classic car restorations, which has become a valuable archive for enthusiasts. As for Susan, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she moved to another state and, surprisingly, started working in community conflict mediation. Maybe her experience served as a lesson about the harm intolerance can cause. My Chevelle remains a symbol of Pacific Heights, but it now represents so much more than just a victory over prejudice. It's a constant reminder of how a community can transform when people decide to come together rather than split apart. The story of Pacific Heights continues to be written, page by page, by every new resident who arrives with their own stories and dreams. And the best part is, now we know there's room for everyone. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. 5 years after the incident with Susan, Pacific Heights became a benchmark in Seattle when it comes to condo living. We now regularly have visits from managers and administrators from other buildings who are interested in learning how we managed to create such an integrated and harmonious community. The Classic Car Club now boasts 15 active members, including 3 Chevelle, the newest belonging to Amanda, a young architect who moved in after hearing our community's story. On Sundays, the garage transforms into a collective workshop where knowledge and tools are freely shared. Robert retired from his role as building manager last year, but remains a constant presence at condo events. Ironically, his successor is Tom, the very guy with the Chevelle I met in front of the building. His leadership continues to nurture inclusivity and innovation, always exploring ways to strengthen the bonds between residents. Sophie and Lucas, now 12 and 10 years old, have become the condo's junior classic car experts. They spend hours in the garage learning about mechanics and restoration. Sophie has already decided she wants to be a mechanical engineer, while Lucas dreams of opening a repair shop just for vintage cars. Sarah's app evolved into a full community management platform, now adopted by several condo communities in the area. She even developed a special section devoted to documenting classic car restorations, which has become a valuable archive for enthusiasts. As for Susan, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she moved to another state and, surprisingly, started working in community conflict mediation. Maybe her experience served as a lesson about the harm intolerance can cause. My Chevelle remains a symbol of Pacific Heights, but it now represents so much more than just a victory over prejudice. It's a constant reminder of how a community can transform when people decide to come together rather than split apart. The story of Pacific Heights continues to be written, page by page, by every new resident who arrives with their own stories and dreams. And the best part is, now we know there's room for everyone. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this.